Today, we're taking a deeply important and honestly eye-opening historical journey. We are going to start zoomed in on the history we're all pretty familiar with, and then we'll deliberately zoom out to explore these unexpected global patterns of human exploitation. Our goal is to really understand the architecture of human bondage across centuries and across continents. For a long time, we focused almost exclusively on the Atlantic system, and for very good reason, as we'll definitely see later on. But the rigorous historical truth, when you actually dig into the extensive global records, is that slavery was never just one story. It was this massive, sprawling phenomenon that spanned completely diverse cultures and eras. Which begs a pretty vital question, right? What actually happens to our understanding of human history when we widen the lens? When we start examining trans-Pacific routes, Mediterranean piracy, and Indian Ocean networks right alongside the transatlantic trade, does looking at the bigger picture diminish the horrors we already know, or does it actually help us understand them with much greater clarity? Let's start with Section 1, the Trans-Pacific Manila Trade, and uncovering the Chinos. Drawing on some really incredible research documented by historian Tatiana Sejas, we're going to look back at the 16th and 17th centuries. This was an era when the Spanish crown connected the globe in a totally unprecedented way. The historical records show countless enslaved people being brought from culturally diverse communities all across the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. They somehow survived this brutal Pacific crossing on the Manila galleons, only to be marched directly into the streets and markets of Mexico City. Now, pay attention to the term Chinos. When these captives arrived in Acapulco, Spanish colonizers used this blanket legal category to just completely strip away their distinct cultural identities. It didn't matter if you were from India, the Philippines, or anywhere else in Southeast Asia. You were legally flattened into a single taxable commodity, the Chino. But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. To escape bondage, these enslaved individuals figured out how to navigate a massive legal loophole. In 1672, they successfully started arguing in colonial courts to be reclassified as Indians. Why? Well, under Spanish law, Indians were considered indigenous vassals of the crown, meaning they were not legally eligible for slavery. By securing this legal status, they literally fought their way from bondage to liberty through the courtroom. Moving on to Section 2, White Slavery in Barbary and the Mediterranean Corsairs. So let's zoom out from the Americas entirely and cross over to a completely different geographical theater. Through the detailed 19th century texts of Charles Sumner, we are transported straight to the North African Barbary states. Because here, for centuries, European Christians, from the coasts of the Mediterranean all the way up to the chalky cliffs of England and Ireland, were routinely captured by corsairs and sold into slavery. A crucial part of this is understanding the very linguistic origins of bondage. And it's a dark irony, actually. As Sumner points out, the English word slave originates from slava, which means glory. It was proudly assumed as a national designation by the Slavic people of northeastern Europe, who were themselves historically subjected to massive, devastating enslavement. History is just full of these incredibly dark ironies. Charles Sumner, who was a really fierce American abolitionist, used the history of the Barbary states brilliantly. He used this striking rhetorical juxtaposition to impartially expose the blatant moral hypocrisy of European and American nations at the time. He basically pointed out, hey, you're fighting naval wars to end the slavery of white Christians in Algiers, but you're simultaneously operating a brutal slave trade of Black Africans across the Atlantic. All right, Section 3. Shared legal and moral patterns, the architecture of exploitation. Despite the massive geographic differences between the Pacific, the Trans-Saharan routes, the Indian Ocean networks, and the Mediterranean, we see these chillingly shared legal patterns. We can clearly contrast two main frameworks here. On one side, you have just war captivity. This was driven by theological and religious differences. It was used to justify the enslavement of Muslims by Christians, Christians by Muslims, and early indigenous captures in places like Manila. But on the other side, we have the highly formalized asientos. These were state-sponsored monopoly contracts explicitly designed for the transatlantic trade, which shifted the justification entirely away from religion and straight into sheer economic machinery. But on the ground, the lived reality for the enslaved was horrifyingly similar everywhere. Whether it was in the public squares of Algiers, where captives were literally made to trot and have their teeth inspected like cattle, or in the bustling slave markets of the Caribbean, documented by UNESCO, the horrific reduction of human beings to mere livestock and chattel remains tragically consistent. The total erasure of identity, the physical commodification, these are the universal, undeniable hallmarks of human bondage. Finally, let's look at Section 4, the singular Atlantic horror, and its unprecedented industrial scale. By looking at slavery globally, we can clearly see how a comparative frame actually strengthens our understanding of just how distinctly horrific the Atlantic system was. Think about the sheer scale of this staggering figure. According to UNESCO's scientific research into the cultural slave trade, between 1716 and 1756 alone, 3.5 million African lives were imported into the American colonies. This volume of human trafficking over just 4 decades is absolutely unprecedented in human history. The historical data lays bare a really harsh reality. Unlike those sporadic, opportunistic corsair raids in the Mediterranean or the localized Manila galleon crossings, the Atlantic trade was a ruthless state-sponsored machine. As European powers fiercely fought for monopolies, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the English, the trade became directly intertwined with the rising Industrial Revolution and an insatiable global demand for sugar. Okay, let's dive into this absolutely crucial distinction. While previous systems historically relied on the outcomes of war or religious differences, where, a captive might actually one day be ransomed or assimilated, the Atlantic system engineered something entirely new. It created an inescapable, multi-generational, and strictly racialized economic engine. It wasn't just some unfortunate byproduct of conflict, it was the literal foundation of an entire economic order. We're talking about commercial treaties, sovereign decrees, and company charters that legally transformed human flesh into an unprecedented, mathematically calculated global commodity. Entities like the English Royal African Company or the Real Compañía de Comercio de la Habana treated human lives purely as capital that was required to develop agricultural empires and consolidate colonial wealth. So we'll end our explainer today with a vital question to reflect on. Having widened our historical lens to see that slavery existed across the globe and across empires, how does recognizing the singular industrial horror of the Atlantic system permanently change the way we view the roots of global capitalism? The evidence clearly shows that the transatlantic trade wasn't just a dark chapter of the past. It was a foundational, mechanized cornerstone of the modern economic world. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the history we think we know.